Hello and welcome to Comprehension Points video Snark. I'm making my way through Fallen by Lauren Kate. If you haven't seen the other videos, you might want to do that before jumping into this one, or else you might be confused. Links will be posted below. Chapter 4. Luce wakes up and briefly is excited that it's Tuesday, because Tuesday is always waffle day. Even when things started to go bad in Luce's life, she could always count on waffle day. Except she's at a boarding reform school, and there will be no waffles for her, and she briefly thinks about all of the awful things that happened to her the day before. Oddly enough, she classifies her encounter with Molly along the same lines as having her phone taken away and her bizarre encounter with Daniel in the library, because priorities. She then realizes that she's up before the sun, which is something that she never does, and not because she's a teenager, but because low sun means that it's a prime time for shadows. As she's moping about what she's going to do for the next 3 hours until classes start, she suddenly remembers that she was issued a detention for tripping and being bullied, but whatever. So she hustles to get dressed and runs to the cemetery, because apparently having a forbidden forest would have been too much for the author. She goes to the cemetery, where she recalls that her only instructions were simply to go to the cemetery. She seems to be the only one there for now, or she just doesn't know the place enough. She stands by the gates, which she feels probably dates back to the Civil War, and looks down into the graveyard. It's described as being bowl-like, with the tombstones looking like spectators looking down into the arena. There's also mausoleums, and since this book is trying so hard to be grimdark, those will probably come into place sooner or later. Penn randomly shows up and says that the others are waiting for her down at the monolith, which, how the heck is Luce supposed to know specifically where to go in the cemetery? She hasn't even been here 24 hours yet. Luce goes, where she finds pretty much all of the other named characters save for Penn, who is a good girl and never gets detention, although in Penn's defense the bar is set pretty low at this school. The teacher doesn't even care that nobody had told Luce where to meet them, and I think that that is insanely rude. Anyway, the teacher then asks who wants to pair up with Luce since it's her first time. This leads to Cam and Ariane fighting over who will get her. Ugh. Luce ends up with Ariane. Their task is to clean the statues and headstones and such. Luce finds the work brutal. She was never given detention at her old school, and even then she'd always heard that it was more like writing lines rather than manual labor. And then even the book mentions how cruel it is that all Luce did was to be clumsy and to be bullied, which makes the entire thing more frustrating. Luce looks over and sees that Daniel and Molly are cleaning another statue. She asks Ariane if the two of them are friends, but Ariane scoffs and says no, that you just gotta pair up for detention. She continues on and says that other students aren't exactly the kind of people that you look for in regards to close friendships. People don't come to the school for any other reason being that they're society's rejects. This makes Ariane question why Luce is there in the first place. Luce hesitates, but eventually tells her when she starts to badger Luce. She was with a friend when a fire started. Luce made it out, but not Trevor. Luce doesn't remember much, but what she did tell the judge made them question her mental state. For a brief moment, it almost seems like Ariane understands what Luce went through, and then she starts talking about Luce like she's a pirate, even though that she isn't. But Ariane has already gone off to tell Roland about this. Luce just feels bad because she knows that within minutes the entire school is going to think that she's a pyro, and she's still worried about what Daniel would think about this. And speaking of Daniel, Luce stops working and just stares at him as he works to clean his own statue. A random intrusive thought pops into her head that Daniel has always been a hard worker, but she has no idea where that thought came from. Molly catches her staring at Daniel and warns her away from getting involved with Daniel. That's pretty much all Molly says, and then she just walks away. But Daniel apparently heard his name and starts walking towards Luce. And I have to quote this entire paragraph because it's just completely and utterly ridiculous. She knew the sun had gone behind a cloud. If she could break his stare, she could look up and see it for herself. But she couldn't look up, she couldn't look away, and for some reason she had to squint to see him, almost like Daniel was creating his own light, like he was blinding her. A hollow, ringing noise filled up her ears, and her knees began to tremble. Sure, okay, why not? When Daniel comes over to Luce, he asks what Molly said to her. Luce then cracks her knuckles, and Daniel says, I hate it when you do that. Luce is taken aback by his weird phrasing, but eventually chalks it up to more like, I hate anybody who does that. Luce tells Daniel that Molly had warned her away from Daniel. He asks if she will stay away from him, in a way that Luce swears is almost flirtatious in nature. And then the shadows come, because of course they do, and the statue that they're standing by randomly topples over. Daniel grabs Luz to protect her, and they end up in the cliched "you saved my life" position as the statue settles into the mud. Naturally, this draws the attention of everybody else. Cam comes over and helps Luz to her feet, saying that he saw the statue start to fall, but that he obviously couldn't have made it in time. Daniel just gets up and walks away without another word. The teacher is kind of upset that the statue fell, but at least she doesn't blame Luz for it and focuses on the fact that it's just an old and clearly unkept statue. Chapter 5. We skip the rest of Tuesday and jump straight into Wednesday. Luce uses her one phone call a week in order to call her friend Callie. Callie is upset that Luce hasn't contacted her in the 3 days that she's been there, apparently having missed the part where phones aren't allowed at the school. Callie's mind has been going into an anxiety-fueled panic when Luce failed to get in touch with her, and I get that it's scary to not hear from somebody you love for a while, but even if Luce did have her phone, it's not like she wouldn't be without reason to not call for 3 days. Luce hears Kelly watching Roman Holiday in the background and randomly compares her life to the movie. At this point, at least it's not another Pride and Prejudice reference, or worse, Romeo and Juliet. Ugh. However, something hesitates in making Luce tell her friend about Daniel. She knows that Kelly has some pretty high standards as far as men go, and knows that somebody like Daniel would fall pretty short. Although I'm not quite sure that she's been at the school long enough to establish anything like what Kelly's looking for in a boyfriend. And furthermore, it's a reform school. If Kelly is looking for manners and sappy love poems, she's going to be insanely disappointed. But instead, Luce tells her friend about Cam, but also admits that she's been there for only 3 days and hasn't really gotten to know the others all that well. And speaking of Cam, he shows up and says that he booked the 7 p.m. time slot to make his weekly phone call. So the entire school, and they only have one phone for the students to use, no wonder that they have to limit it to once a week for 15 minutes and then for them to book a time slot. But as Kelly protests that she's barely said anything to Luce, Cam says that Luce can take his 15 minutes. Just then the line cuts off. It's some sort of special phone with a timer that automatically disconnects after those 15 minutes. Luce is just angry that she didn't even get to say goodbye. Cam asks if Luce was talking to her BFF and says that he's got 3 sisters, so he knows about things like that. He also asks if the friend was asking about all of the reform school bad boys. Just then a shadow comes in and hopscotches across the ceiling tiles. Luce knows that bad things happen to people when she's alone with them and when they're focused on her. Which, okay, sure, let's go with this and circle back to this idea probably at a later point. Daniel then comes in and we take a moment to reestablish that yes, he is indeed still hot, in case you'd forgotten. But Luce also can't help but notice that as Daniel comes in, the shadow leaves. Cam then tells both of them at the same time that he's having a party in his room later and asks if both of them will be there. It's only after Daniel wordlessly agrees that Luce also agrees. Later, they're given wraps around the grounds, which I can only assume is for gym. I'm insanely confused as to why they're running. While they're going, Penn and Ariane trying to explain the aforementioned Social Wednesday to Luce. They say that the government mandates social time for the students, but the school doesn't know what to do with it, so they rotate between what the others describe as 3 movies and then give them a lecture about what they just watched. And then we find out that they're not running because they have to, but because they don't want to end up in the seats next to the teacher, because priorities. And then they go on to say that it's not so much about sitting next to the teacher, it's that the teacher makes the students closest to him work, not only by handing out the worksheets to fill out after the movie is over, but to make them stay late and analyze the papers, which would make them miss the after party. And I'm once again struck by the thought of how lax that random things are at this school. They don't have phones and only get to call for 15 minutes a week each, but they're allowed to throw raging dorm parties in rooms that they can paint. As soon as the girls get into the room, Ariane then calls out to the other new kid. The poor boy is the one who gets roped into helping out the teacher. Penn calls what Ariane did mean. Luce looks around the room and spots Cam. He catches her looking at him and smiles and waves in response. Luce thinks about how her few exchanges with Daniel, it was the exact opposite. And speaking of Daniel, he and Roland come in late enough that the only seats are on the floor in the front of the room. They have to pass in front of the projector, and Luce can't help but notice a chain around his neck. I'm sure that this will be relevant again soon. The movie is predictably bad, and all the other students openly mock the lead actor. However, as the movie goes on, more and more shadows begin to appear. Luz clutches the bottom of her chair so tightly that Ariane asks if she's okay. Later, the three girls go to Cam's room for his party. Penn seems anxious about the entire thing. When Cam opens the door, Luce notes the smell of cigarette smoke, and again, I'm just annoyed that the author seemingly has no clue how reform school should function. Cam gives Luce a hug, but not the other girls. Once inside, Ariane goes to Cam's desk, which is said to be doubling as a bar, and there is champagne. Look, I get the drinking because at least it doesn't leave a smell that's hard to get rid of, but the cigarettes? Come on. All of this would have been way more believable at the prep school. At least Luce makes a mental note about the differences between her prep school and now. She says that she didn't even know how to get alcohol at the prep school, and it was way less closed off than the reform school. Ariane calls Luce to come over because she wants to make a toast. Penn still seems anxious and hasn't even come into the room. She tells Luce to go inside, but Luce herself is hesitant, not quite sure what's going to happen at this party. However, Luce convinces her to come inside, and they do. Once inside, Cam grabs Luce's hand and says that he's glad that she's there, that he'd been anxiously waiting for her to show up. He hugs her again so hard that he picks her up. While she's in the air, Luce sees Daniel watching them from across the room. When Cam puts Luce back down, Luce can't take her eyes off from Daniel, which she admits is weird because there's a hot guy who's clearly insanely into her and she's only focusing on the guy who clearly wants nothing to do with her. Ariane gives a toast to Luce. Cam puts a cup into Luce's hand. Molly says something mean, which makes Luce ask Penn if Molly is mean to everybody or if Luce is special. Penn says that it's just how Molly is, but in a way that makes me question what she'd been intending to actually say instead. Luce then thinks about how Roland is able to smuggle anything into the school, as she's certain that most of this is thanks to Roland. She wants to ask for a cell phone, but something gives her pause in continuing down that line of thinking. And speaking of Roland, he then opens the mic up for karaoke. Ariane eggs Daniel on, but he refuses. Roland eventually puts on some other song. Luce watches Daniel, who keeps checking his watch. She feels like Daniel wanted for her to be at the party that night, but now that she's there, he's completely ignoring her. She wants to talk to him. Halfway through Roland's song, Daniel stands up and leaves. Luce gets up as well to follow him, but Ariane notes her standing and seems to think that this is Luce volunteering to sing the next song. Luce gives some paper-thin excuse of the other new boy missing out. They seem to buy this. Cam asks if she needs company to go get Todd, but Luce refuses. Outside in the hall, Luce overhears Daniel talking to Gabby. She's saying that a mysterious unknown thing won't happen again. Daniel sounds threatening yet upset that Gabby had broken her promise. This encounter makes Luce assume that the two of them are in a relationship, and Luce decides that she hates Gabby. And, oh boy, not only are we ending on what I'm going to assume is a huge misunderstanding of this situation, but we're also going to throw in some girl-on-girl hate because of a boy. Again, I feel like I'm just waiting for the actual plot to show up. I feel like this is a reoccurring theme in the books that I've been reading recently, where I'm just endlessly waiting for something to actually happen, but nothing ever does. And it's just that car stuck in the mud. I feel like this book is trying to set something up, but with the prologue as well as the constant appearance of the shadows, but we'll see. Thanks for listening to my book Snark on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and be here next Monday. Don't forget to check out my other video Snark series. If you're new here, then I also run a Tumblr where I post daily book Snark. I also have a Patreon where I post early releases of my daily Snark, but also bonus Snark that isn't up anywhere else. Plus, all supporters get a big shout out. Thank you so much to Don and Phoebe for supporting me already. You can hear your name next week by joining my Patreon for $1 a month. However, since it is a recurring charge, I also accept PayPal and Ko-fi. Also, if you want to read some of the stuff that I publish, and you can purchase my works on Amazon. I have 17 erotic short stories, 1 short story collection, and 1 full-length novel. Links for all of these things will be posted below. See you next week, guys. They don't have phones and only get 15 minutes and only get